Anpatu washte, tatea akwaloi lakotia imachiapi na Kelsey Ducheneau washichuye imachiapi. Good day, everyone. My name is Kelsey Ducheneau. I am a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, and I'm the Natural Resources Director for the Intertribal Agriculture Council. Today, I'm joining you to talk a little bit about consulting with a client as it relates to conservation planning. I have participated in the Natural Resource Conservation Services 9-step conservation planning boot camp, which is a 3-week boot camp that they host in Lincoln, Nebraska, in the USDA building, where you get to interact in the National Soil Lab. We get to go out and do some conservation planning on the ground. We get to work with an actual producer as the landowner and walk with them through identifying what their goals are and coming up with a conservation plan. So a lot of the information that you're going to see here today is not just information gathered through their National Planning Handbook, but also through my direct engagement with producers and understanding how producers like to be consulted with, and considering from me being a producer myself, how I would like people to talk with me and to engage with me in my conservation planning as it relates to the land that I get to steward. So we're going to jump right in and get started here. The Conservation Planning Bootcamp walks you through a 9-step process. These 9 steps are broken down into 3 phases: Phase 1, Phase 2, and Phase 3. We're going to dive right into Phase 1, which is collection and analysis. So as we walk through this, I'm simply going to identify each step, and then we'll actually get into some of the nitty-gritty of walking through a scenario, a plan for a producer. So step 1 is determining objectives. As we determine objectives, we really need to think holistically. We need to consider what the producer wants. If the producer is not the landowner, we need to think about what the landowner wants and how that relates to what that individual producer who's operating on that land currently, how that's going to impact their ability to steward the land. We need to also determine, is the producer thinking long-term or are they thinking short-term? And try to help that producer identify those objectives, not just short-term, but also long-term, right? All right, we also need to identify the problems. Once we've determined the objectives, we will figure out what problems are preventing us from meeting those objectives. This is where you would talk about resource concerns. SWAPA plus H plus E, as NRCS discussed it. You know from prior communication with me that I don't like to talk about problems. I like to identify opportunities. So typically I cross that out and we talk about resource opportunities. And I like to use the acronym HESAPA, H-E space S-A-P-A-W. And those are our resource opportunities: humans, energy, soil, animals, plants, air, and water. HESAPA. Those are our resource opportunities. And we like to identify opportunities when we talk with a producer because nobody likes to think that their operation has issues. It kind of makes you feel bad. It makes that client assume that negative connotation that comes along with the word problem. So after you've gone through step 1, you've identified your opportunities, and now we're transitioning to step 3, inventorying your resources. Now, this is going to hopefully be as holistic as it possibly can. When you inventory resources, you should seriously work through every single of the 7 resource categories with HESAPA. And you need to consider inventorying the human resources. How many people operate on the operation? How big is the operation? What's the energy like? Is there ability for wind turbines? Is there free-flowing artesian water? When you consider the animals, we have to think not just about livestock, but we also need to think about the wildlife. and all of the soil microbes that exist below ground that we don't see. We need to consider soil health. We need to think about water and the availability of water. We need to go through all of HACCP, all of the 7 resource opportunity categories, and we need to inventory them. And what that inventory looks like really does depend on the operation. If we are working with a small 10-acre plot of land, we might go out and do a couple soil samplings to get a good read on the soil organic matter. If we're working with a 10,000 acre tract of land who a producer's running livestock on, we're going to need to think a little more large scale, right? We might do some transect lines where we go out and we catalog the biodiversity that exists. We might do some forage production clippings. We might try to assess the inventory differently based on the land mass which we are planning for. Once we get that inventory though, the inventory then allows us to get down here to analyzing the resource data. And this is usually where you need a comparison. The Web Soil Survey does a really good job of presenting kind of standardized understandings of what low, moderate, and high quality production would be on the various soil types across the country. Websoilsurvey.com or the online has a very functional web-based map interface that you can use to actually dial right down into the little plot in your backyard to do a web soil survey analysis on it. And it presents to you some benchmarks that you want to compare your resource data against. If Web Soil Survey indicates that your plant community in your pasture in Dewey County, South Dakota should have a 2,200 pounds of forage per acre productivity, you can go out, you do those grass clippings in the step 3 inventory resources, and then you compare it against you analyze it against the resource data that you find from Web Soil Survey. And if you're finding that the 2,200 pounds is above what your actual gathered data is, then you know that that's a benchmark you can aim for, right? If you found that you've already surpassed that, it might be important to actually revert back to identifying the problems and considering if your land is already producing higher than what's predicted for it, are your initial problems or opportunities the same? So phase 1, collection and analysis, it's 4 steps to this phase. They kind of all play together. It's just this constant cycle of feedback throughout all 9 steps. Once you've gotten to analyze the resource data, though, our ultimate goal is to come up with a plan, right? So we have to transition on to the next phase, which is phase 2. And in phase 2, before we get there, we will determine the objectives most often by sitting down with the producer, talking with them about their experience so far, understanding where they want their ranching or their agricultural operations business to go moving forward. We will then identify the problems by, opportunities, though, because we're talking with the producer. And you're going to go out there, you're going to spend some time on the land, and you're going to actually visually see what's out there. Then it's time to inventory the resources. You get your hands dirty, you dig the soil pits, you figure out what the infiltration rates are, you collect that data, and then you analyze that data against the benchmarks that exist out there. Maybe your neighbor has some benchmarks that you can get from them. You never know. You just got to figure out what resource data is available for you to utilize. And then there's some data that's not location specific that will help you to better interpret your data, such as height of different vegetation stands. You can use those sort of standardized tables to justify if your vegetation is matching where it should be at that time of the year and with that amount of grazing pressure. You can also calculate your percent height removed based on taking grass clippings and measuring against, or not grass clippings, grass measurements, and measuring against the plants that have not been grazed and the plants that have been grazed. And then based on the percent of the height removed, you can calculate the amount of weight removed. So if you're going out there to assess the inventory, it's important to understand at what point of the growing season you're assessing the inventory, because if it's too late in the year, the producer might have already grazed that pasture. And so you might get a forage production calculated to be somewhere around 1,100 pounds, but that's after grazing. So you need to actually do some of the math to figure out what the actual inventory is based on the time frame in which you are doing the quantification of the resource. And there are charts out there that help you to understand the growth distribution of the different plants that you might be using as your indicator species. All valuable tools that you can use to assess your resource data. And then we transition into phase 2, where we discuss decision support. We start with step number 5 right here, where we formulate alternatives. So again, we start to refer these alternatives back to our resource data against the goals of the producer. So we need to consider what the producer wants, what they currently have in their resources, and where they want to be in their goals. So we start with where they're at, and we figure out what alternative paths they have in order to get to where they want to be. So as we formulate these alternatives, we should consider, again, what the producer's opportunities are. If they are a producer that is fairly young and fairly active on their ranch, is a full-time rancher, then you can throw out a lot of alternatives that require a lot of intense labor. If you're talking about working with a producer who's late 60s, early 70s, they're retired, they don't spend a lot of time out and about every day because their body just can't physically handle it, then we need to consider alternatives that are not going to be as labor intensive. They're not going to be as time specific. They're going to offer a little bit of flexibility based on that individual producer's health and wellness. And these are just considerations that we need to take into account as we, the conservation planner, are developing and designing these plans. So we'll formulate the alternatives. We'll then evaluate those alternatives. And an evaluation process genuinely just considers all of the ranking criteria that might help the producer to ultimately, in this phase, step number 7, make the decision. Making the decision is an important consideration, and keep in mind that the decision should not be yours as the conservation planner unless you're going to volunteer your time to go out there and help them with putting that plan into place. The decision has to be something that the conservationist, the landowner, the land manager, the operator on record, that individual has to want to take ownership in that plan, or it's not going to be successful. So again, a recap. With phase 2, the decision support, we start with formulating our alternatives. This usually requires some level of a map to be constructed purely to draw out what your alternatives are. You might be talking about, designing a cross fence right here. Having a map there helps you to talk the producer through what the proposed alternatives are. And it helps also, if you can, to show a design of what the different alternatives look like. If you have a description of different management practices that you're proposing, that would be helpful information. Then it's important to evaluate the alternatives. And here's the exact same tract of land. It simply has a different level of coloration to it. And this is where a plan is actually drawn out to indicate here's some alternatives that can be utilized. This is where your water locations are. Here are where your current fences are. All the red lines are the proposed new fence lines. And you can start to piece apart what the different practices are, again, and how they match up for the producer. And then making decision, like I said, it genuinely rests in the producer's hands, and it needs to. And you, as the consultant or as the conservation planner, you need to really support and contribute to informing that producer and educating them on what their steps forward will look like. But it's not your responsibility or your role to persuade them one way or another. It's absolutely 100% okay for you to offer recommendations and to offer your insight, but just remember that you should be coming from a place of support and acceptance of what they make as their decision. Absolutely empower them to make the best decision that you think they're fit to manage, but don't push them into a circumstance that is not going to fit into their operation. For instance, let's talk about that 72-year-old rancher again. If you have designed a plan for him that is going to require intense twice-a-day movement of a half-mile stretch of electric fence from June until August, that's probably not going to work. And what's going to happen is they're going to start on that plan and they're going to be really jazzed up and really excited and really hopeful for the benefit that they're going to provide their land because of the plan that you helped them to design. But after day 24 or 25, they're going to get tired. Their back's going to be sore. They might have a grandkid that's got a sporting event that they just can't miss. And they're going to miss a movement day. They might miss a whole week because things just pile up and, well, the grass looks okay anyway. What happens when our producers get tired is they start to get overwhelmed with the amount of work that needs to take place as it relates to this conservation plan, and they might not stick to the plan 100%. And when your plan is dialed in to that specific of a multiple day rotation, you start to cause a irreparable damage, quite frankly. And so we need to consider presenting alternatives that are realistic for the producer and guiding them to making an empowered and an innovative and respectful decision in how to manage the land. But we also need to respect them as the land manager. Then we transition into phase 3, which is the application and evaluation phase, right? So we just got done over here. The producer was making the decisions. They pop up here to step 8 in phase 3. Step 8 is implementing the plan. We alluded to this a little bit. This is when the producer takes that piece of paper, the packet of paper and all of the job sheets and all of the specific and detailed and time-oriented information that you've prepared. He takes it home and he hopefully sets it right on his kitchen table, and it only leaves when he goes out to implement the plan every day. You don't want him to take it home, put it in the filing cabinet, and never think about it again. You don't want it to end up in the burn barrel. You want it to be usable. You want it to be user-friendly, and you want to see producers appreciating and valuing that workbook and being able to function within it. It needs to be well built and very legible. And if you're working with an older producer that has a hard time reading, go ahead and bump the font size up a little bit. If you're working with a young producer that doesn't have as much experience, go ahead and put in more pictures, trying to educate them on different grass types because they're not exposed to it yet. As they implement the plan, they're probably going to contact you often with questions. And it's important that you're available to answer those questions. Because ultimately you want the plan implementation to work so well that you can evaluate the plan. And in the evaluation phase, that's where you go back out and you inventory those resources again. And you no longer use the web soil survey benchmark. You don't use the graph benchmark anymore. You use that original data point, your original inventory of resources as your benchmark. And you compare where you started, where the producer is now. And as you start to make that transition, you need to inform the producer of what to look for when they're implementing the plan. You know, make sure that they know you prepared the plan based on a typical moderate year. And if we transition into a severe drought, we're going to need to shift that plan. If we end up coming into a year that is phenomenal rainfall, nice cool temperatures, perfect ideal growing conditions, then it may not be necessary for the plan to be as aggressive as it was. Perhaps it allows the producer some leniency in waiting out an extra rainy day or two before they go out and they fence all day in the mud. So just consider these indications of how to help the producer throughout this implementation phase. It's probably going to take him, depending on the plan, multiple years, multiple growing seasons, and just help him or her to prioritize what that looks like. And then again, they will come back to evaluating the plan. And in the evaluation phase, it is you're responsible, in my opinion, for following up with the producer and encouraging them to evaluate. And it doesn't have to mean that you show up on their operation and you help them do all of those inventoried resources again, but a phone call, an email, a Facebook message, or whatever way that you communicate with that producer would be so incredibly important to just help remind them that, hey, we built this great plan. We need to benchmark. We need to be able to know if it's working. We need to evaluate it. So can you go out and get those resources inventoried? So there you have all 9 steps of the 9-step process. Once you get to step 9, you'll see these arrows that take you back, right? And based on if the plan is working, like I said, we're going to use step 9 of evaluating the plan, and we'll connect it back here to the inventory resource original data. And if they match right here, and they show no change, then maybe we need to come back to making the decisions, right? And we need to adjust what decisions we made and re-implement a little different plan. If it shows that it's working, phenomenal. Maybe the producer just wants to stick with it and let it work for a while and continue to see to what point though that success will plateau. And then he can reevaluate his resources, make different decisions, and implement a new conservation plan. If it's not working, that's probably the most urgent indicator of when you need to either come back here to reanalyze the resources, or you need to come here and make some different decisions. If the indications of the data are showing a negative impact, you really should work with that producer to whatever extent they will allow or encourage, and support them to adjust their plan a little bit. So now we're going to walk through this process using a scenario that I've created. We're going to start down here with determining our objectives. And as we determine our objectives, we need to, again, meet with that producer. This particular producer, she decided that she wanted to increase her forage production for her livestock. All right, so we started to identify the problems. We went out there and we looked across the landscape, and we found that she had certain pieces of land that were getting overgrazed, basically because of general topographical conditions. So there was flat pieces of land that were up in the corners of the pastures, and the wind would blow just right where all the cows would get up there and they'd fight flies or they would graze. The water tank was nearby. That's where she was putting out all of her mineral, right there on that flat piece, because she thought that's where the cows are. I'm going to take the mineral to them. Well, what ended up happening is they just got too spoiled. They just like to stand up there in that corner. All the mineral was getting brought to them. They didn't have to go out and look for it. The water was right there. It wasn't hard on their back, or it wasn't too much work to walk up and down the side hill and graze. So they just hung out there. And so what we decided was we needed to get a baseline measurement. We went out and I taught her how to do inventory her resources through forage calculations, where we actually took a ring out there. We took grass clippings and we weighed them to calculate what the productivity was across an entire acre, to understand really how her land was currently producing the forage. And we did infiltration rates, where we took a metal ring and we pounded it into the ground and we poured an inch of water in to see how long it took for the inch of water to infiltrate. And that's a direct correlation to the soil health. and the soil organic matter, and how quickly and effectively her land is able to soak up the rain that she gets. And when it soaks up, it doesn't cause erosion, right? It doesn't roll down the hill and take soil with it. So it's an important measurement for her to be able to quantify. And then we did a biodiversity count. This is one of my favorite considerations of a inventory that can be done for producers. It's really simple. I have a little clicker that I have on my saddle, or you tell a person to keep a little counter clicker in their pickup, in their ATV, wherever they might find it, or might be out driving through the pasture in their tractor when they're haying. Every time they see a new plant species, just click it and count how many different plant species you can find in an area, whether it be driving through the pasture, moving cows to the next pasture, or driving down to the river to take your grandkids swimming. Just be aware of the different diversity that exists in the plants. And, it doesn't stop there. Consider the differences in the wildlife too. Are you seeing more species this year or less? Is there a higher number of those species than last year or more? Those are really important considerations and easy tools to get the producer training their eye to constantly be inventorying their resources. And then we come down to step 4 and we analyze the resource data. So we actually pulled up a map of her operation and we interpreted the forage calculations and the plant community biodiversity rate against the Web Soil Survey predictions that existed online. What we found out is that her production was a little bit low, and so it's appropriate for her to want to increase her forage. Basically, yeah, that's a realistic objective, and it fits with the potential of the land. So we then transitioned over to step 5, which started the decision support phase. At this point, I started to consider her ability as a producer and started to present different alternatives. The alternatives that I formulated were to, 1, build an electric cross fence that would prevent the cows from getting up to the piece of land that they were overgrazing. 2, build a permanent cross fence that would be there permanently. The electric fence would be something she would put out at the beginning of the growing season and take down before winter hit. It would be something that she could flex from one year to the next. It could be something that took a little less time to build. And then the permanent cross fence is something that would just be there permanently. Maybe a 3 or 5 strand barbed wire fence, some high tensile fence, something that's there. It's not going to be moved from one year to the next. You don't have to take it down. Another thing she could do is she could adjust her grazing rotation. If she were to not graze in that pasture at that time of the year and she were to graze in a different pasture first, it would give that piece of land a break when it typically doesn't get one. The fourth idea, this lady really likes to be out riding her horse. And so a forage production management system that's really being kind of brought to light again and utilized and maximized across the country is migratory grazing. You can actually reinstill that migratory pattern of your herd animal. You can teach your cows to be a herd again. You can teach them to migrate across the pasture. It does take a little bit of time of you basically shepherding your cattle or your livestock for a while, and every day you got to go out there and you move them, you place them basically to the part of the pasture where you'd like them to graze. So I'm going to pause here quick and go to the next page because I want to highlight the importance of step 5 and step 6. You have to consider all of the alternatives that you formulated. And then when you start to evaluate the alternatives, there are important criteria which you should evaluate them against. And those criteria are determined basically by the operation that you're trying to assess and the environment in which you're working. the financial resources of the producer that you're working with, the available programs that can contribute to this producer. And so you need to consider the cost, the labor, the timeline, the ability. Those were the number 4 or the top 4 evaluation criteria that I could assess from this particular producer. And so I built together this spreadsheet, right? This is real simple, me considering the top 4 criteria that I need to help her assess against, and then the different alternatives. And then when I sat down to present the alternatives and help her to evaluate them, I started to consider, all right, well, your electric cross fence is, it's going to be a low cost as far as infrastructure that you're going to have to purchase, comparable to the amount of infrastructure or investment that you'll have to make in doing the migratory grazing pattern. You might have to contract with somebody to help you understand how to train your cattle to be this way. And then the permanent cross fence is going to be a little bit more than the electric cross fence and the migratory grazing. And the adjusted grazing rotation is not going to cost you anything. It's just going to cause you to shift where you turn your cows out to. But when we look at the labor category, electric cross fence, you're going to probably be out there moving it a couple of times of the year at least. And it's going to happen every single year. You're going to have to do this. Where your permanent cross fence, it's going to be really labor intensive the first time. The second, third, fourth, from year after year, it's just going to be maintenance. It's not going to be taking it entirely down and putting it all the way back up. So a little less labor. The adjusted grazing rotation, the labor is going to be a little different because you might have to go to a further pasture away to check your cows for that calving season. But it's not going to require anything different necessarily than what you were already doing. It just might be a little bit less convenient for you. The migratory grazing, that's going to take a lot of labor. Every day you're going to have to go out there and move your cows, check on them, pick them up at the water tank and put them and place them in their new grazing spot for that day. So as you work through evaluating these alternatives with the producer, this is where it gets really easy for us to kind of insert ourselves into assessing the needs or the preferences of the producer, because we have our own preferences of what we would like to do if we were the ones implementing the plans. And that's not okay. We have to be very cautious in not inserting ourselves into evaluating these decisions, and we should evaluate them based on the producer. So with this producer, we actually made our way through all of the evaluation phase. Then we came into step 7, where we were going to sit down with the final plan or not with the final plan, but with the evaluated alternatives that were presented, and we're going to make the decision. So typically I would like to give this plan of alternatives or suggested alternatives to the producer, let them take it home, let them think about it for a little bit, schedule a follow-up meeting with them at which you sit down and you listen to them, and you help to consider what the best plan is moving forward. At that point, you then transition into step 8 and then step 9, which are phase 3, application and evaluation. So step 8, you will implement the plan. This particular producer, she wanted timeline-specific information, and she wanted concise instruction. She decided that she was going to do the electric cross fence, but she'd never used electric fence before. So I did a lot of research and I presented to her all of the information that she needed to know on how far away you should set the posts, what sort of posts are available, what's going to be more cost effective, what sort of wire she should use, how to train her cattle to knowing what electric fence was. And I also connected her with a couple of regenerative grazing groups on Facebook, because they seem to really talk a lot about tools that you can use for putting in cross fence and making sure that your cattle respect it and maintaining the wire so that it's less of a cost investment every year. Really, really helpful information that would allow her to communicate with another community of producers that were using similar alternatives to enhance their resources. After she implemented her plan, it took a growing season of her working through the obstacles of implementing the plan that we presented. And I called her later that fall and I scheduled a time to come out the following spring and help to assess the success. And depending on your initial inventory of the resources, you'll be able to get an idea of how degraded the opportunity resources are, or if they're sincerely depleted. It may take a few years of this implemented plan before you see a significant change. But the important part of why you want to assess that change from the first implementation to the 1 year benchmark is because if it's still getting worse, then you're not appropriately addressing the issues. It may take a while for there to be a substantial improvement, but if within the first year or two it's still getting worse, the improvement's probably not going to come, or you're going to need maybe some more aggressive approaches to in order to make those alternatives work. So it's important to establish that timeline for assessing the progress and be realistic with the producer. Hey, this piece of land looks like, maybe it's been impacted several years in a row, and it might take a couple of years before we see the thistle species die back. If the second and third year the thistle are even more aggressive, then maybe it's important to look at a different approach with that producer. Take the time to follow up with them, to evaluate their plan with them, make sure that they're still inventorying their resources, and help them evaluate what they should do next. Now we're going to transition a little bit into discussing some methods and manners in which you should communicate with producers as you consult with them. First and foremost, it's critical that we remember we're working with an individual's livelihood. We're not just talking about their day job. Their day job is what they live and breathe every single day. When they're up at 3 a.m., it's not necessarily because they're worried about that spreadsheet that's due on Friday at the work office. It's that they're worried about if their calves are healthy. They genuinely feel like they've got lives in their hands. And so as you're talking about this plan, really try to breathe a lot of that empathy into the plan and to consider that we're working with living being creatures. And these creatures deserve the utmost consideration and care. And that's what that producer is trying to provide. Based on, depending upon where they're at in their life, they might be more successful or less successful at providing that high quality care. And they might not know how to provide that high quality care. So as you are presenting suggestions or considerations, just please remember, this is this individual's livelihood. This is their sweat, blood, and tears. And this is how they're caring for their family. This is how they're contributing to the next generation. This might be all that they know how to do. It might be all that they have ever wanted to do. So don't just talk about this as a particular caseload that you're working on to get pushed out the door so you can move on to the next one. Take the time to genuinely appreciate and understand what that producer is working through. Some other helpful considerations as a consultant, when you're starting to advocate for preparing plans for people and working with people, you need to consider, who are you trying to reach out to? Who is it fitting for you to reach out to, right? Do you have a particular value to offer them that they can't realize other places? And what is that value worth to you as a consultant? How are you going to put a dollar value on assisting a producer? When are you going to accept payment? Are you going to fundraise through external grant programs so that you don't have to charge the producer, but you can still afford to offer the technical assistance? These are all really important considerations that will set you up as a skilled conservation planner moving forward. Consider too, sometimes things aren't going to be in your wheelhouse. What are your key areas of expertise? and who should you be trying to appeal. If you've never raised a sheep or never been around a herd of sheep in your entire life, you probably might not be the best consultant for a sheep manager. Now, that's not to say you're not going to be a good consultant for assessing the quality of their grass if you're a grass nerd like me, but you should really figure out who to reach out to collaborate with as you consider some herd management plans so that you're not putting that sheep producer into a circumstance that you're not knowledgeable of. It's important to start to categorize referrals. And the cool part about making sure you have referrals is the only way you can have referrals is if you can have successful clients. And in order to know that you've got successful clients, you have to have your clients evaluating their plan. So as long as you're following through all the way to step 9 of the 9-step conservation planning process, you're going to be realizing producers that are starting to be happy with their results. Those are your referrals. They're your success stories. You ask if you can highlight them as a success story. You ask if they would be interested in serving as a mentor with another client of yours. You figure out ways to enhance that network across the landscape. And you need to consider community engagement, right? Is there a way that you can reach out to the local youth in your community? Take them out on a job shadowing experience. Go talk to the local students at the high school or even the elementary school. Get them excited about agriculture and natural resources as a career path because, just like our land stewards who are preparing the land for the next generation, we are preparing the conservation plans for the next generation. And eventually somebody's going to have to take our job in carrying forward that really important work. It's important to meet the producers where they're at. As a consultant, especially within natural resources, you're not going to get the typical 9-to-5 job. And I feel like the most conservation planners don't expect that or don't want that 9-to-5 job. And that's why they're in the world of natural resources. You're going to have to meet the producers at inopportune times on the weekends and the evenings and the early mornings, whenever the ranch or the operation doesn't demand their attention. That's a good time for you to try to meet with them. And some flexibility is absolutely necessary. Understanding the world that they live in is not dictated by their Google Calendar. It's dictated by the livestock and the wildlife and the weather patterns that they're working with. And so you need to meet the producers where they're at. That goes also with understanding how educated they are about particular areas of resource management. It's not our job to judge their lack of access to knowledge or understanding as it relates to what they're doing on the land. It's our job to continue to inform and to continue to educate. And sometimes we need to meet the producer where they're at. Maybe a producer doesn't know that what they're doing is harmful to the land. It's just what grandpa did, right? So we need to empathize with where they're at and help them to find a path forward in a way that is considerate of where they exist in understanding their impact on the landscape. And then we need to enhance our service through partnerships. And that's what I was referring to earlier with the sheep producer. I'm not a sheep guru, but I have contacts that are. And I'm totally comfortable with pulling those contacts in and asking them questions and communicating with them to make sure that the plan that I'm presenting to my producers is going to put them forward in reaching their goals and not backward. We also need to adjust our plans accordingly. So that's not just based on the presented goals of the producer, but it's also, it's your responsibility to get to know the producer and to understand where they're coming from and to understand their likelihood of adapting certain practices or principles and understanding those practices and principles. So we need to, one, consider the producer's ability. Are they very physically active and very young and capable of putting in 5 miles of fence within the first year? great. Go ahead and put that into their plan if that's something that they want. But if, their physical ability doesn't allow them to go put in 5 miles of fence in the first year, think again of that 72-year-old grandfather, then maybe that's not the best plan. But maybe that he's got grandchildren that will help him over the course of 4 years put in 5 years of fence line, right? So flex that plan. Your goal can still be 5 miles of cross fence line, but it might not all have to happen in the first growing season. You might have to prioritize where that happens and how it goes. And, it might be important to communicate with that producer, to ask them, do you have any family that might be able to help you with this? We don't want to overwhelm you with this plan. The availability to help, that goes multiple ways. One, of the producer's family, but two, of you as the conservation planner. Now, as you're presenting these plans, it's critical that you use language that puts the responsibility on the land owner or the land manager, whoever you're working with. It's the conservationist's job to implement this plan and to take responsibility for it. It's not the conservation planner's job to be out there putting in the fence line. And if you're talking about the plan with a producer and you say, we're going to go put this fence line in and we're going to dig this well and we're going to build this dam, we're going to replace all of the bottom wire with smooth wire for antelope and bird habitat. And, what's going to happen is that producers imagining all of these things are getting implemented and you're out there helping them, and you won't have that ability. You don't have that time. So it's important to use, you will be implementing this plan. You will be building the cross fence. You would have to get help to build 5 miles of fence within the next 3 years. Be careful of the language that you use and be considerate of your availability to help, and be realistic with them when they say, will you come help me do my inventory resource management? Be honest. Yeah, I absolutely will prioritize that. I will make it happen. Or I don't know if I'll be available that time of the year. It's a really busy time for me, and I'm actually spending that month in North Dakota. So consider being honest throughout that phase in helping them to understand their responsibility they need to take on this plan. And then there should be an assignment of the workload that should be time specific. You should help them identify who's going to do the work, or propose to them who could do the work. So if they're going to have to hire somebody to trench a pipeline, be knowledgeable of the different trenching companies locally that you can connect him with, so that him or her, so that they can do the shopping there. And then also know that the workload should be assigned across years, right? Or across growing seasons, across months. Make sure that it's time specific so that the workload is assigned outward in a way that can be successful. Have open communication. Don't be afraid to ask the awkward questions. Just do them in a respectful manner, and understand that communication style sincerely matters. I understand that I'm not going to reach a large group of people from this online recording. I'm going to have to actually be in person doing these trainings so that people will want to attend. A lot of people don't like to do e-learning. A lot of people like to do in-person learning. Same with our producers. Some of them will like to see things through their email and communicate that way when they can. Some of them will like to have text messaging going back and forth. Some of them would prefer a phone call. Some of them would just prefer to come in and visit whenever it can work out. So you need to match your communication style with them. I am an introvert. I don't like to do a whole lot of the phone calls and the in-person meetings and stuff. And I shouldn't say I don't like them, but it's not my preferred style. And my preference doesn't matter. It's the producer's preference. What they would like is what I need to do. That's a responsibility I have as a conservation planner. Take follow-up seriously. Doesn't matter at what phase in the planning process you are, take follow-up seriously. Make sure that if you met with them once to determine their goals, but then you were going to plan a day to go out and inventory the resources and it rained that day, don't just let that producer fall through the cracks. Give them a call the next chance you get. Set reminders and alerts on your phone. Keep a running list of producers that want your assistance and reply back to that. Follow up with it. And this is something that I personally feel like I need to do a better job of as a technical assistant supporting conservation planning, because it gets so easy to be overwhelmed with your own operation or new projects like doing this recording that you're not following up with all the producers that you would like to. So set designated chunks of time just for follow-up, for making those phone calls. And it doesn't have to be returning missed phone calls. Sometimes it can be initiating a phone call and just following up with somebody that you met at the grocery store that said they were interested in learning about your programming. Take the initiative to be the one to make the first phone call, and you will just be so appreciative that you did once you get that producer moving further down the line, or once they have moved themselves further down the line. If you have questions, please leave a comment in this workshop thread. I'm sorry the video ended up getting so long, but we covered a lot of really important information. When you consult with a client, it is so critical that you do it in a manner that is thoughtful, considerate, and conducive to a positive path forward. And I hope that I was able to offer some steps and some recommendations that will help you to do that. If you have any questions, leave a comment here or go ahead and reach out to me at kelsey@indianag.org. Thanks for hanging in there with us.